my last student walked in, so I think we're ready to go. We got a lot of snow out there in Saskatchewan, Cathy knows very well. I mean, in Crandall University, Cathy knows very well. So we're glad we got that class, but it wasn't substantial. I'm just going to introduce quickly my class. Cathy, you're set to do already?
Yep, we're all set.
Excellent. I'm going to try to turn my visual here on actually roll my visual so I can see my class. There we go. All right, here we are. And there are two hands in the left hand coordinate. There we are. We got two cities right there. Cities in one place. All right, the other city. We got two in the city.
So now you can move him. We're great.
Okay. So, the sociology religion is what Cathy Crandall is involved in. There are lots of journals, and Cathy Holtmann showed a recent article from two journalists and mine quantitative, really lots of paper, and Cathy's going to be more qualitative about in a few minutes. Research question for this article was, why do we go on high religious and have an origin to religious moment? The question was, why do we go to the church a lot? What are the lessons that we involved in religious relations? And this is a question that Harry is going to answer. I think it's easy to tailor religion surveys as a representative sample of the result with a sample size of 1,608. We ran this out in 90 when we mailed the survey, and that's how we introduced the sample. So it's a good result. There are research questions like this.
Sam, I want to just interrupt. Could you speak a little more slowly?
Okay.
Thanks.
I certainly can. Please have a try. So, church attendance exams, we know that people who attend church are less likely to be involved in same-race relationships. But it's probably not the fact that they're racist that is independent. It's not likely that racist people are church. It's more likely that the crowd that hang around us are really like them. And they are like them not religiously, but also racially.
Great, Sam. You're doing just fine time-wise. So we have some time here for questions from University of Saskatchewan students. Sam, just to give you an idea of where we're at, we're just starting into looking at the relationships between variables and causal sequences. So this is right along the kinds of work that we've been doing in the last few classes. So are there any questions from you guys in terms of what Sam's talked about? Any need for clarification? Sam, I have a question to get started. Sam, can you explain the difference between a confounding variable and then this moderating or mediating effect that sameness has on religious attendance? Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Sam. I think the students here are a little bit shy to go in front of the camera. Yeah, yeah. Maybe another question, Sam, in terms of the variable religious attendance. Why, for so long, has that been just assumed to measure a person's religiosity? Why has that been such a commonplace kind of assumption, and now Perry all of a sudden is or maybe Perry isn't the first, but why is that now being questioned? Okay, great. Yeah, I know that that's the case with Statistics Canada questions about religion. Usually it's limited to whether or not you attend on a regular basis or whether or not you think it's important. Can you, Sam, explain the Baylor survey a little bit more? Why is this survey unique and helpful in this regard? Great. Thanks. Are there any questions? Okay. Shri? Oh, he doesn't have a question. Okay. Okay, Shri, go ahead. Ask your question.
My question is, did you see like what happened when there were two people, like if both the partners came from two different religions? Could you see that?
Right. I think I answered the question to be when two people come from different religions, do they tend to be partners?
Yeah. Partners, what's their sense of spirituality here, or turning up to the various spiritual occasions?
Yeah, sorry, I was still hearing the question, but I think I can answer it. Yes, it's much more likely that two people who have different religious views, who are spiritual, are much more likely to form a relationship than people who are religious in the sense that they go to a religious service. First of all, the less likely to meet because their social networks are different. One is very active in their congregation. But another reason is for the reason that was explained in the article, that they tend to have a limited social network with law. And because people who are religious are much more dedicated to their brand of religiosity than people who are spiritual, it's much less likely that two people who are strongly religious will form a consider a relationship than two people who are spiritual.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Are there any questions from your students?
I'll ask if you can hear a question about that article. For Saskatchewan, we set up a little different this year. I'll ask repeat the question from students early.
I think we have a question here, Sam, while your question is getting ready.
Okay, great.
Can you repeat your question?
Okay, let me use Bible as an example. Some people, they interpret their Bible based on how they understand it. So how about people that they believe in they are in the same religion, but they don't interpret themselves the same way?
Okay. So, Sam, the question is, what about couples who share the same religion but interpret the Bible differently?
An interesting question. As far as how they form relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends. What we tend to see when people get married is that the person with the stronger religiosity is the one who's sort of with today. And that is usually the female. So if the female is more religiously dedicated and has stronger religious views, what tends to happen is the male will, whether the person with weaker religion, will often move in that direction. Remember, married couples tend to persuade each other and build each other. And so often we can move in there when couples get married or involved in a relationship.
Great. Thanks.
In light of time, Cathy, should we switch to your question?
Sure, sure. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to introduce you there in Moncton to the class here. So I'm just moving the webcam. I don't know if you can see us. There they are. So wave, guys. Do you see us, Sam? Okay, great. So we're about 25 today. It's Friday, and it's snowing here, which is unusual. And it's a big snowfall. I think we're getting 10 centimeters today. Yeah. they're starting to get the cultural differences here between Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. So I'm going to be talking about changes in the spiritual meaning of belly dance. So Shri is just going to pull up the slides there for the class. And we'll go to the next one, Shri.
You're going to need to share out your desktop there. Please actually stop the sharing there, and we'll get you to share your desktop with Cathy so that Sam can see it.
There we got it.
Got it? Okay. Go back. No, this one. Okay, great. Okay, so Rachel Krause's research is qualitative, and her research question is, how does the spirituality that some practitioners associate with belly dance change over time? She defines spirituality as a personal search to connect with the sacred. She's interested in spirituality in general because, according to other research, people with high levels of spirituality are happier, have higher self-esteem, feel more optimistic, have a stronger sense of life purpose, believe they have stronger relationships, and feel more in control of their lives. And she defines sort of two general types of spirituality. People who are dwellers associate spirituality with belonging to a religious group or institution. And then there are seekers who find spiritual connections outside of religious institutions. And these groups define sacred, or what is religious, differently. Now, there hasn't been a lot of study of spirituality and change among spiritual seekers. It's assumed that they find spirituality important, but there hasn't been a lot of study of change. So, and I think largely this is a methodological problem. Because seekers don't belong to groups, it's more difficult to make surveys about them or to get them as part of research projects. So it's difficult to access seekers, and it's difficult to keep accessing them. So she's designed a research project that's longitudinal. So she wants to track change over time. But as all researchers know, a longitudinal study is difficult because you have to keep track of these people, and people tend to move. And a large portion of her sample was associated, or part of her sample was associated with university students, and they're a particularly mobile group. Okay, so her methods, I think she uses some participant observation because she's actually a belly dancer herself. So she's immersed in belly dance culture. In 2006, she has 75 dancers in her sample. And then in 2011, that sample is reduced to 35. So part of that is just normal attrition, but also she's interested in tracking people who have said that belly dancing is spiritual for them because she's interested in spirituality. So she's narrowed down that sample herself, and then likely it's difficult to get a hold of everybody in the original research. In 2006, she used a short survey, so a kind of a quantitative measure, but she interviewed people with semi-structured, in-depth interviews at both points in time. Okay, so she interviewed all 75 original research participants and then re-interviewed 35 people 5 years later. The content of those interviews, because they're qualitative, is different. Okay, she's asking them different questions in 2011 than she did in 2006. So her data consists of data from the survey that was coded, and then she uses that to describe the sample. So most of the women in her research were between 30 and 40 years old. They had been belly dancing for an average of about 15 years. They're mostly middle class, fairly homogeneous in terms of racial background, and most do not attend religious services regularly. So most of them are not dwellers, the majority are seekers. However, some of the sample are dwellers. Some are tied to religious institutions. Yep.
I wonder if you can maximize the PowerPoint there, sort of on explaining really quickly.
Yep.
So the slideshow there, maximize the smaller.
How's that? Okay, great. We'll go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. No, go back to the data. I'm moving ahead of myself. Okay, so most were seekers, and then she has a wealth of data from these interviews. She said the interviews ranged from about half-hour long to 2 hours long. Okay, a 2-hour-long interview, when transcribed, can be, I don't know, 60, 70 pages of material. And she's got 35 participants. So she's got a lot of data to sift through once she's finished her transcriptions. And what she does then is, in her analysis, she uses data from the survey to decide, sort of categorize these people in terms of their spirituality. Were they fairly spiritual at the beginning, or did they consider themselves not very spiritual in the first wave of the survey or the first wave of data collection? And then in the second wave of data collection, she's going to assess change in individuals. Okay, so if you started off as someone who was highly spiritual, did you remain highly spiritual, or what happened? Okay, so she's divided people into different groups based on the survey results. And then, after she's, assessed people in those different groups, she's going to look for general patterns of change among the entire sample. Okay, so she's analyzing individuals and their change, and then she's looking for patterns of change in the entire group. So when she looks at patterns, she identifies 4 themes. And there I just list the themes from the article. And I think she does a very good job of showing examples. So when you were looking at the outcome of the regression models, there was a table. And then you could see from the table the results of the statistical analysis. When you do qualitative research, we also show the results of our analysis, but we show the data. We often show a good example from the data that illustrates our findings. So for example, Krauss, when she's showing an example of someone who had spiritual stability, they were at a certain level of spirituality in 2006, they continued to belly dance, and their spirituality was somewhat stable. And so she shows a quote or several quotes from people in this group, and I'll just give you one. So one woman said, "I am a Cherokee. So growing up, I went to powwows and stuff like that. And you see people dancing for 48 hours straight. It is an ecstatic form of dance. And I never felt spiritual when I was dancing at a powwow, but I have belly dancing. So belly dancing with me has been the most vivid experience I have had in my life. Dancing with a big group of women, expressing anything that I feel. Those things just contribute to being spiritual." And I took that quote from page 468 of the article. So she shows these different categories of spiritual change among the seekers and dwellers in the belly dancing group. And she comes to some conclusions. She says that from the research that she did, that seeker spirituality is more available to artistic leisure participants. Okay, she talks about belly dancing as artistic leisure activity. okay? And so seekers tend to be involved in more, non-religious looking kinds of activity. Artistic leisure doesn't really come across as a religious activity, but the people who are involved in it can see it and understand it and feel it and know it to be a spiritual activity. She also says that seeker spirituality is related to stability and change. Okay, so she saw stability in terms of spirituality, and she saw change among seekers. When she looked at the results for dwellers, dwellers were more likely to have a stable spirituality. Okay, so that belonging to a religious group and institution, as well as being a belly dancer, contributed to being more stable in terms of a spirituality. Okay, so the seekers tended to be a little bit more fluid in terms of change than the dwellers, but the majority of people in her sample, remember, are seekers. So she's seeing different types of change in that group. So I think I'll stop there, Sam, and open it up for questions from your students at Crandall.
Great. I'll ask Susan that question, and I will repeat it in time so that my here. Who's our first question? That yours. Alicia's question is, from what you know, Cathy, are we getting stronger in the area of seeker spirituality, or is it more like the dweller spirituality? Which do you say is growing?
Oh, good question. I think, as you mentioned, Sam, we're starting to unpack this whole idea of spirituality in a way that we haven't done previously. I think we assumed that people who attended religious organizations and were involved had, on a regular basis, just automatically had spirituality. And what we see is quantitatively and qualitatively, we are seeing variation in spirituality. And so our measures of spirituality have changed. Not only are we asking more detailed questions of people within religious organizations about their spirituality, we don't simply assume that everybody who's highly involved in religion has the same kind of spirituality. And now we're also asking people who say they're spiritual but not religious, we're trying to also have a sense of what is that spirituality like? Does it change, or is it fairly stable? So I think what we're seeing is we're unpacking this idea of spirituality, I think, in a variety of contexts. And for me personally, I do this kind of research. I don't specifically look at spirituality, but I look at something called lived religion. And in my own research with women, often their religious or spiritual practices are different than what religious groups define as standard religion or spiritual practices.
Cathy, the question was, in the theory section where they talk about changes over time in the religious trajectory, certainly noted that young people are less likely to attend, and sometimes when they get older, they're more likely to attend. Can we expect similar changes over the life cycle in spiritual activity, spiritual commitment, using religious behavior?
That's a very good question. Perfect. I like that a lot. I think, yeah, you definitely see lower rates of participation in religious groups, at least in Canada. I'm not as familiar with the American data, but in Canada, the younger you are, the more likely or less likely you are to be attending or identify with a mainstream religious group, and the more likely you are to say that you are spiritual. However, spirituality is, as I said earlier, is something different than being part of a religious group. And so, do we see changes in spirituality based on age? So we see differences in terms of affiliation with a religious group, but do we see change in terms of spirituality? I don't know of research that actually looks at this. However, in my own qualitative research, many of the women talk about how their spirituality has changed and deepened and become more important as they get older. And they talk about, and most of the women that I have interviewed are members of religious organizations, and they talk about how their spirituality has become more important as they age. So I think it's a very interesting research question. Would we see even young people who don't affiliate with religious organizations deepen or say that their spirituality becomes more important as they age? This would be a very interesting longitudinal study. But again, the challenge is, how do we access those people, and how do we track their responses over time? In a qualitative study like Krause's, which is very small, and she knew the participants through her belly dancing networks, she can, do a fairly good job of keeping these research participants as part of her research. In a larger survey, like the Baylor survey or like a social survey, the general social survey, it'll be difficult to track this kind of thing over time, but I think very important. We want to see them. Here, on this board, yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think the kind of research on spirituality or religion that's non-institutional, or what I would call lived religion, is fairly new. We're having publications and books in this just in the last decade, because we're still figuring out how to measure spirituality or religious activity outside of religious institutions. So it's very new. We're on the cusp of that. And even convincing scholars of religion that this form of religious activity is really religious is still work. Not everybody buys the argument that what we're measuring is really religious. Okay, so there's still a lot of work that I think qualitative researchers are doing that just sort of, it's not mainstream yet. Although it's great to see Krause's research published in a fairly major journal, because I think that says something about the quality of her research and the kinds of conversations that are taking place among researchers of religion. But I think there's still a long way to go, and so we need more research like Krause's, where people who are engaged in activities outside of religious institutions that they see themselves or understand as religious, we need more of that kind of research. But as I said, it's still fairly marginal within sociology of religion for sure. And you know, we need supervisors who are going to help students figure out how we can measure or how we can assess or how we can understand this kind of phenomena better.
Great question. Good question, Cathy. The question has to do with the level of commitment we see in spirituality. So she noticed that in the article there was quite a bit of change over time with people's spirituality, and it seems to change because of holiness or Cathy was in the group of one of the examples that we read and then we walked out. Whereas we often talk about religious commitment, people have to sit down or tender.
That raises again that question about spirituality both within and outside of religious groups. I think we have for many years assumed that people who regularly attend have a homogeneous kind of spirituality, and that simply going to church or participating in a religious group on a regular basis sort of means that, you know, you're spiritual. And because we're unpacking that, we're seeing different kinds of spirituality among people who are very regularly involved in religious groups. So the assumption that spirituality is somehow, or the commitment and spirituality go together, I think that's being questioned. Again, what Rachel Krauss's research shows us is that, yes, we can't assume that spirituality among those people outside of religious groups is consistent or the same. And so, yeah, commitment to what? Is it commitment to a group? Is it commitment to a regular activity? Or is it a commitment to this spiritual journey? I mean, I think those are all different research questions, and they need to be unpacked so that we can better understand spirituality, and we can better understand the group kind of dynamics, because the article that Sam reviewed sort of shows that, you know, even though people are very committed to attending religious service on a regular basis, doesn't necessarily mean that they embrace all of those teachings of that religious group. So, for example, the author of that article points out that most religious groups have this belief in the equality of all people, despite race, gender, or any kinds of differences. But we saw that people who were very regular attenders, in fact, had quite racially segregated relationships. So a lot of the assumptions that we have about religion are being questioned by both of these articles.
All right. Cathy, would you like one more question, or should we wrap it up?
Let's just see if there's maybe a question here in Saskatoon.
That'd be great.
Anyone here have a question either for Sam or for me about either of the articles? Okay, Sam, why don't you wrap things up?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Cathy, for getting that together here. It's been great to have to do that with us, and so thanks for that. Let me say a couple of things about what we've been talking about today. Religious versus spiritual. This has been something really
Well, thank you, Sam, and we're waving goodbye to you folks on the East Coast. Thanks a lot, Sam. This has been great. Okay, I just...